Hesty here. Today we're going to do new axles in a Mark IV VW. So today we're actually going to put a Raxle in, which is a high-end axle that if you call them, they'll make it to the specific length for what you're doing with the car. The other good thing is it comes with ARP fasteners, which are high-end fasteners. So it already comes with a nut because this is a one-use nut. You torque it on and it stretches a little bit to hold in there. So when you take the old one off, you got to throw it away and get a new one. The same for these inner bolts. They're a one-time use also. So when you're putting them on, make sure you torque them to the right spec. But before you start taking the car apart, making sure you have everything you need the axle and you need the new set of inner bolts. The first step before you jack anything up is to loosen up some of the hard to get nuts. If you have it up on jack stands and you try to bust that 30mm nut loose, very likely you're going to drive it off of the jack stands. Or it's going to be turning so much that you can't get the torque on it that you need to break loose at 148 foot-pounds. So before you jack it up, take your 30mm socket and bust that nut loose in there. To access that nut, it depends on the kinds of wheels you have, but you want the wheels on, but you got to pop out that hub cover. On these model of wheels, it's just a little plastic cover. You stick a screwdriver in there and pop it right out. Different VWs have different styles of wheels, and this process is very similar for other makes besides VWs. So pop that hub cap off. Get your 30mm nut in there, and then your big breaker bar, and just break that nut loose. And you may have to put a fair amount of torque on it to break it loose because it should be pretty tight. Okay, all we did was break it loose. Next thing to break loose, in the case of a VW, it's a 17mm with the stock wheels, is your lug bolts. So you break those loose, then you're ready to put it up on jacks. Okay, so now we got the car on the jack stand. Wheels are chalked on the other side. Wheel is off, and now we're ready to look in there and see what's going on. So we've got 6 of those bolts to loosen. You can see 2 of them there behind the transmission case. Now you can just see the 3rd one there. There's 6 total, so we need to loosen those. That looks like that. So what I'm going to use is a 13mm socket on it, and then a long extension that I can fit all the way up in there. Now it's going to try to turn on me as I'm torquing that loose. So what you can do to help keep, if you don't have a buddy here to hold it, you can put a screwdriver in the vents on the brake disc, and that'll bump up against the actual caliper and keep that from turning while you untorque those bolts. And then the reverse process when we're putting in the new ones will do the same thing. So there's the first one. Sometimes you got to take a little bit of a pick to clean that out because it'll be full of road grime and such, because you got to make sure that 10mm triple square fits seated all the way down there. A lot of guys get frustrated that they strip these out because they don't get it all the way seated. They tap that in to make sure that triple square is seated all the way. I've never had one strip out if I got it seated right. When they strip out, it's because you're not getting it seated. And if you strip one of those out, it's a son of a gun to get out. So be careful with it, don't strip them out. Now I'm going to run that nut the rest of the way off. I cracked it loose before we took the wheel off. Now I'm going to go ahead and take it off. So there's the old nut. Don't mix that one up with the new one. Next step here is to get the end link off the sway bar. And that's simply by taking out this 16mm head bolt here. We're going to put our jack underneath the lower control arm or the A arm and run that bolt out, and then we'll be able to swing that up out of the way. Then we've got the inner bolts off and the outer nut off. What we need to do is drive the axle out of the hub. Bunch of different techniques for this depending on what you got, and it depends how long it's been in the car, how much corrosion is built up in the splines. Sometimes it pops right out. This car is pretty easy because I just did these axles. So if you have an air hammer, like a pneumatic air hammer, you can put that right into the point here and drive that out. If you don't have an air hammer, you can use a small sledge or a big hammer. A couple of different techniques. I've got an old half-inch drive ratchet extension that I use. Basically, it's like a big punch, and I put that right in the end there and drive it in. And you don't need to go. You just need to watch those threads till it starts moving. I don't know if you can see that that's moving there. Another thing you could try is taking the old nut and putting it back on there and then hammering on the nut. You want to be careful not to hit the hub and ding up the hub. And it sort of depends on what you're doing with the axle when you're done, how careful you want to be. This axle is basically going to the steel recycler because it's already broken beyond rebuilding. So I'm not worried about dinging up those threads. But if you're just getting that axle out to do some transmission work, like maybe you're putting in a new clutch, then you want to be very careful not to ding up those threads. And it'd be more important to use something that you can just ding on the end of it and not get at the threads. Again, if you're having a big trouble with it, you can try shooting some PD blaster or some kind of penetrating oil up into those splines and letting it sit, maybe even tapping on it a little bit. But basically, you're just going to drive that axle in a little bit. Once that's done, now we're ready to loosen up the hub so we can pull the hub out a little bit and slide that axle out. The next step is to detach the bottom of the ball joint from the lower control arm. There's 3 bolts that you need to take out. I recommend taking a scribe and scratching you a little mark before you loosen it so you can get that lined back up and you don't change your alignment on the car. So I'm going to take the camera and shove it up underneath the hub here and see if I can show you exactly where those bolts are. Okay, here's looking at the bottom of the control arm. That's the bottom of the ball joint, and here's your brake rotor, just for orientation. These are the 3 bolts that hold the ball joint into this control arm, and that's what we got to take out to slide that hub and the ball joint out. Then we'll be able to slide that axle out. Bottom here, and yank slightly, and you'll see it swing out. Now that we got the hub loose, we can pull it out, pull the axle out of the cup, swing it down past the A-arm, and there's our axle removed with the broken end. So I've cleaned up all the old grease that slung out of the old CV joints in there. Now we're ready to put the new one in. First thing I did before we try to put it in is you want to put a little grease or anti-seize just on these splines here to slow down the corrosion, so the next time you need to get the axle out, it doesn't take as much banging. Then we're going to put it in the reverse action that we took it out, or we took the old one out. We're going to pull that axle, we're going to pull that hub out, slide in this end, and then pull that whole assembly out so that we can set the cup end into the transmission. The next step is to get these bolts in from the drive axle into the transmission. Depending on the car, you may see a couple of different methods of running these bolts in. The Mark IVs generally don't have the torque spreader plates. The Mark IIs and some of the Mark IIIs do. This is the torque spreader, so it goes, 2 bolts go, obviously one through each of those holes to help spread the torque around the circumference of the axle there. So I'm going to put these on. These came with the axles. If they weren't there to begin with, that's okay. A lot of the cars come without them, so don't sweat it. It's a little bit easier not having to put these in, but let's go ahead and run those bolts in. Now that we got all the bolts in, we're going to torque them down. Now that we got the CV axle to transmission bolts all torqued down, let's get our sway bar end link back on. So we swing the end link back down, and you may have to put a jack up underneath the ball joint to bring that control arm or that A-arm up a little bit so you can get that to thread in. So now we just have the axle nut to put on. This has a little strange torque sequence on it. You torque it to 148 and then loosen it a half a turn. And I am able to get it to torque. So now you loosen it a half a turn. There's half a turn. Then rotate the axle 180 degrees. So those two bolts will be up here. Once you rotate that 180, then you torque it back down to 37. Okay, there it is clicking. Final step after you hit that 37 foot-pounds of torque is to add 60 degrees, or 1/6 of a turn, or 2 points on that nut. So you can make a little mark in there and then bring 2 tips of the nut past it, or you can count 60 degrees here. So that would be 90, so 60's here. And there our axle nut is torqued. Now that we're down off the jacks and the jack stands are out, let's make sure we got those wheel lugs, lug bolts torqued up. One last thing I forgot to mention before we put the wheel back on, I wiped down the brake rotor with some mineral spirits just to get off any grease I had gotten on it by handling it, so we can maintain our braking power. Other than that, we're done, ready to get back on the road. Thanks for watching. If you have suggestions, comments, another technique, questions, please put them in the comments below so that the next guy can benefit from what you bring up. Thanks for watching.